Joining us now to discuss the Cuba boat situation is retired U.S. Coast Guard Rear Admiral Peter Brown. He's also a senior fellow at the America First Policy Institute. Thanks for joining us this morning, Admiral. I understand that you have an extensive understanding of Cuba from your time in service. Of course, we saw Rubio say that he was awaiting input from the U.S. Embassy in Havana, not to rely on the information coming from the Cuban government. We also, of course, operate the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base and the prison in Cuba. So how reliable do you think this information coming through the filter of the Cuban government on the matter is?
Well, thank you for having me on, Carrie, and I appreciate you bringing me here for this. I'm going to go with what Secretary Rubio has said, which is we don't fully trust everything that Cuba is telling us. What we think we know about the situation is purely from the government of Cuba, and an independent investigation to find out the true facts will be important. It's also important to recognize that it's not a coincidence that this happened just about 30 years after the Brothers to the Rescue shootdown. That was on February 24th of 1996. And in a somewhat similar action, Cuban forces shot down two civilian aircraft, and the investigation that proved it was in international airspace, contrary to Cuba's claims. So I think Secretary Rubio and Vice President Vance are doing the right thing, trying to bring the temperature down a little bit while calling for an independent investigation.
And you can't look at the matter, of course, as an isolated incident. With the capture of Maduro, with their very close sort of ally in Iran on the ropes. We saw that related package about the meetings in Geneva today. What does Cuba potentially have to gain by stirring the pot in this way? Whether, if it is similar to what you described in that previous incident where it was the boat was in international waters, what might they try to gain through this type of both action, but also the press-related component of it as well?
Yeah, so the government of Cuba is primarily interested in its own regime survival, not in the well-being of the Cuban people. And the president's national security strategy calls for a prosperous, free, secure, and stable Western Hemisphere. And so he is increasing in a number of ways the pressure on Cuba's regime, sanctions, both primary and secondary sanctions. And as that pressure ratchets up, we've gone from what had been a relatively stable but tense equilibrium to a now somewhat unstable and even more tense scenario with Cuba. And regime change ultimately and the freedom of the American people is for the administration and for the people of Cuba, including Cuban nationals or Cuban refugees in the Florida area.
And Admiral, as we've heard from Iran experts, some of the concern with any type of regime change is these sort of so-called poison pills or things that could be done when they do face existential threat, extinction, to create a bunch of havoc along the way. Do we have similar threats in Cuba, being that we have a military base on the island and it's right in our hemisphere that way? Or could they potentially create some destabilizing things if they are on the verge of a regime change?
There's always the potential for destabilizing action, and our history with Cuba is replete with a number of incidents in which the Cuban communist regime specifically pokes at the United States. They think helpful to them in terms of their domestic political consumption. In the international realm, they've relied on support from Iran, from Russia, from China, from Venezuela for decades. The Cuban economy is unsustainable on its own, and the current sanctions are proving that out.
And in terms of the naval situation between Cuba, just 100 miles off the coast of Miami, you mentioned that there have been other flare-ups in the past. What does that situation on the sea look like in terms of their naval capabilities?
Well, their naval capabilities are basically, rusting Soviet-era equipment, and their Navy is certainly no match were it come to a force-on-force incident with the United States. And the naval base in Guantanamo Bay is an important U.S. asset that we will rely on and protect. The primary interaction with the government of Cuba is through the Coast Guard to the Cuban border guard. And Secretary Rubio, in his comments, remarked that there's communication to the Coast Guard. I expect that will continue. Again, we're at a time now of heightened tension, but I expect that communication will continue, and that will be the primary mode of communication between the U.S. and Cuba, certainly on this incident. And then higher level talks may happen regarding other matters.
And if we pan back a little bit, clearly these boat strikes on cartel activity, whether all connected to Venezuela or some just being attempted cartel activity, what is the situation in the waters on the Cuban side, in the Atlantic, but also in the Pacific at this time?
Well, the drug strikes have been a new tactic that the Trump administration has applied to the goal of saving American lives. So, in a presidential proclamation from last year, the figure is cited of about 200 U.S. deaths per day from illicit drug trafficking, including overdose and related crime. And so the strikes against the narco terrorists in international waters are a measured response to a chemical weapon warfare that's being waged against the United States from China through South America and Mexico toward the United States. And so if we can choke off the profit and the impunity of the criminal cartels by taking these strikes, I think that's a very good approach from the president to really achieve a strategic change to what had been in the past small tactical actions.
Well, we appreciate you sharing your insights both on the drug boats, but of course on this flare-up that's happening in Cuba. We'll be watching with great interest as our own investigation from our own embassy comes forward. Appreciate your joining. Peter Brown.
Thank you, Kerry. Appreciate your time.